Well, Jay, here we are. It is 2026, and this is our first special Your Morning Coffee episode of the year. We're very excited about this one. It's a conversation with Morgan Hayduk and Andrew Batey, founders of Beatdapp. This company is fighting the good fight against streaming fraud, but that is not all they do.
They've built sophisticated tools to identify AI-generated releases, bots, click farms, playlist manipulation, account takeovers, and much more. Morgan and Andrew join us this week for a conversation about the state of fraud in the music business today. So now, without further ado, here's Morgan Hayduk and Andrew Batey from Beatdapp. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air, on the air, on the air, on the air, on the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Morgan, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. Always good to see you.
You too. Thanks for having us.
For those with no prior knowledge, and we find that there are a few of these folks out there, tell us a little bit about what Beatdapp does, the problem that you're solving for the music industry, and really in plain terms, you know, what you do for labels, distributors, DSPs, artist teams when you're brought on board.
Yeah, I'll jump in because Morgan didn't jump right away. In plain terms, we have a bunch of product lines, but we effectively find people that are manipulating streams or any kind of fraud detection in general. So they could be money laundering. They could be, for example, manipulating streams to steal money from other artists out of the same royalty pools. They might just be trying to do claims fraud where they're pretending that they're and this leads me to answer the rest of your question, but you know, they could be claiming that they own part of a song. Maybe they're claiming they did guitar on a track, but they're only claiming it in Germany for Indian content. So there's lots of different ways that people are always trying to defraud a system. And our main premise is that the industry's better with one sort of provider like us, who are centralizing and doing all of these things. Like we're being the best at catching fraud. So that every individual stakeholder doesn't need to spend tens of millions of dollars trying to defend it themselves. So I think that's the premise. Of what we do is sort of eradicate these manipulations or these fraudulent behaviors from scammers. And it started with streaming fraud. At the time when we first started, we actually sought out to build an audit product. We were trying to answer the question, how many times is a song played on a streaming service? Because I'm sure everyone that's listening's probably had to deal with is you just get a CSV that says artist A with number of streams. Like you don't actually know if that's real. Is that like, how do you have receipts for that? So we started looking at auditing the number of times songs were played because it's fundamentally the driver that determines how much of the pool you get. And when we started doing that, we started seeing all these weird anomalies, like, artists that had the 63 songs that were played in the exact same order, or users that were 8,000 users playing the exact same songs in the same order on the same 4-hour period on a Sunday. Just things that didn't make sense and were logically to the naked eye not normal. So we started building machine learning models to identify that at scale, because the scale of streaming is so large, you can't manually do that. And as we started going and doing that one by one for the streaming services, they started trusting us a lot more and giving us more and more data. So they were giving us gyroscope, battery life, orientation of phone. Like we could tell potentially with the streaming service, like that you played the song at a 72-degree angle on your phone. So like
Wow.
the data we get is very interesting, but it's indicative of what is being manipulated because some things will just look the same across all of those streams or they'll be missing. For example, if your phone was never under 50% battery, who hasn't ever been almost out of battery? Who hasn't ever been in a car? Who's never walked? Like, there's lots of these things that are just obvious when you're looking for things that should be there that are not there in manipulated accounts. And then also the way that you behave is different, the way you save songs, which features you use on your favorite streaming platform, all of those things and your behavior will be different to you. And so when somebody else logs in as you or is using your account, we call that an account takeover, they act differently and they're manipulating streams on your behalf. And I think that that's the core of where we started was let's find all the streams that are manipulated and remove them and make sure that the artists that are actually have real engagement are being paid for that work.
Yeah.
And then that led to a number of other things that we do. I'll let Morgan jump in if he'd like.
Well, I want to ask Morgan, every time I see you, Morgan, at a conference or something, the number keeps going up. And what I'm referring to is just sort of what we believe as an industry is that number of, fraudulent streams or AI generated tracks or whatever that is. How big of a problem is this in the industry today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we'll separate the fraud from the AI,
Sure.
though they're definitely, in a symbiotic relationship that I think is probably growing. But keep in mind, 1% of market share is about 200 million US dollars. So usually I answer this question by saying it almost doesn't matter. If we agree that $200 million is a material number of dollars to be going to illegitimate actors in the industry, then we should stop this problem. And we know for sure the number is bigger than 1%. We think it's 5 to 10% looking across platforms. And I think there are platforms where it's much higher than that. And I think there are platforms where it's much lower than that. But in general, you're 5 to 10%, which puts you at roundly $1 to $2 billion a year that are going to the wrong places. And that's a huge problem. You add in AI, and we do see a number of, fraud schemes, bot farms targeting what sounds like AI generative music to us. And I say what sounds like because the initial way that we were testing it was, the good old ear test of just firing up the music and seeing, does this pass human quality control? And a couple of years ago, the ear test worked really well. There was, it still wasn't definitive. We couldn't include it in our analysis. But if one of our data scientists said, hey, look, I listened to 15 of these tracks and they all sound like slop, that was a pretty good sort of qualitative determinant for us to rely on, along with all of the data that Andrew described. What's happened from 2-3 years ago till now is the ear test just is insufficient. And so I'm sure we'll talk about it more later, but we developed an AI detection model largely because we needed something internally to listen to what we were detecting as suspicious and try to give us a more quantitative sense of, is this, AI music, and is it in conjunction with some sort of fraud scheme that we're seeing? And then as the demand for AI detection for a whole bunch of other commercial reasons has just increased over the last year, we decided to productize our internal model and turn it loose for clients. And I think that's, something we're really excited about. But the two things definitely go hand in hand. And the last point I'll make is just, going back 2, 3, 4 years, the single biggest limiting factor in running a fraud scheme at scale was how much music can you amass, right? So it's hard to have 50,000 tracks in your repertoire that are real tracks. It takes time to make that, even if it's pots and pans being banged together, like it takes some time. And so what you would see is a lot of recycling of content. Someone would get caught on a DSP under one distributor, they would move their content from distributor A to B and they would go back. Well, that world is dead. Like there is no reason, and this isn't giving fraudsters a roadmap. If you can't come up with this on your own, I'm pretty sure you're not running a scaled bot farm of any consequence. But like that world of recycling your content is dead. So being able to cross-reference with this track in this fraud scheme on this DSP 2 years ago and is now being recycled doesn't matter. Because you can generate 10,000 songs over a weekend that are all far more compelling than the slop that was coming out 2 years ago, or whatever the fraudster could steal from someone's Dropbox or create in their living room with their own instruments or whatever they were doing to amass some repertoire. So that the AI is being used in lots of great ways. It's also used in lots of sort of scary ways. And I think for us in the business that we're in, we have to keep pace with the fraudsters. And that means not just keeping pace with like the tactical, how do you run a bot farm at scale, but also what tools are you using to create the music that's actually part of those schemes.
Yeah, I would imagine it's a game of whack-a-mole to some degree, and that your business has probably evolved a lot since you started doing this. Talk about, without giving away anything proprietary, talk about, how do you stay up on top of, these fraudsters? They're looking for any way to sort of circumvent what you're doing. How do you try to stay a step ahead?
We have a really great R&D team who is constantly red teaming things and seeing how they would manipulate, and then testing to see if we can find people doing that, testing our own systems. We are constantly not just relying on the models we've built, but assuming that we're behind and we need to keep catching up. And I think that's helped us stay in lockstep with these fraudsters a lot. What's interesting about the AI content is that in many cases, if you look at the number of actual organic streams from real users of AI content, the number's still relatively low percentage wise. I would argue that the industry doesn't really have a solid business model yet on the AI content when it comes to like new song. If you're an artist, like an AI artist, and you create a song, making 100 million AI songs gets you zero pay if no one listens to it. So what we found early on was there's a huge correlation to the number of AI generated tracks and streaming manipulation, because a lot of these AI generated tracks were being used in fraud schemes. So the reason that we built the AI detection to begin with was because we would already verify that had too many users coming from the same area, that they looked like they were from compromised accounts, that they were, listening in an inorganic pattern, say with like an even skip ratio in between. Like you'll find all of these indicators. So maybe a song or a user flags 17 different models. Then you look at, well, is that song AI generated? And it turned out it is. That's just confirmation to the fact that it was being used in this scheme. And I guess my point is that as the industry evolves and as every one of these platforms changes their models or changes the features or like launches some new thing that that real users are excited about, it's another surface point of attack for these fraudsters who are going to find a way to manipulate it and do something different. And the only way to stay ahead of that is to constantly innovate. Like we are constantly pushing our team to innovate, where we spend massive amounts of money on R&D for what we think are problems 3 to 5 years from now, not problems that we think are existing today. So we're developing things for a much longer future state, and our horizon is much, I think, further out than most people expect.
Well, you were talking about AI music detection. Talk a little bit about how you deal with that, and what is this trust and safety operating system that we're reading about?
So this is the answer to the question in some ways, what else are we doing to make the industry more secure? So the historical business of Beatdapp has been fraud detection, whether that's streaming fraud or claims fraud. And so for our label and our DSP and our distributor clients, it's a lot of streaming fraud analysis. And then for collection societies, it's actually primarily focused on claims, right? So someone representing that they are partial owner of a work that they're not. How do you tell that? How do you adjudicate those claims in an efficient manner to make sure that you're not holding up money that should go out the door? That's the historical business. And we're going to keep, as Andrew said, innovating and refining our approaches to be the best we possibly can at that and take that work off of the internal teams of our clients. But then there were all these other points that we started to notice were, in more mature industries, honestly, were more secure. And so we started looking at things, AI detection, AI music detection is sort of the first obvious, super topical. Everyone's, engaged on this. We've been working on it internally already. We wanted to have something in that regard, and we think our solution for it is great. Then we looked at customer due diligence. And when we say customer due diligence, a lot of people, what they would hear is KYC, know your customer. We looked at the landscape of KYC vendors, and we looked at a lot of what the music industry was doing in this regard. And we found it was fairly surface level. And that's not to disparage anybody's tech, but really like we're talking about a selfie and a liveness check, right? Does the picture match the ID? Does the ID match the selfie, vice versa? Fine. easily gameable, right? We spent some time with a former operator who ran clandestine service operations for the CIA, and he walked us through how they bypassed all kinds of things like facial recognition software and even the best stuff. These things are just like, they're gameable. And so we went out looking for a partner because we didn't want to build this ourselves. It's a very, very complex sort of piece of work. Who could help us do what they call and what we've internalized as customer due diligence. And that's the idea of having everybody who is going to receive payments. So think if you're a collection society, it's all of your registered members. If you're a distributor, it's all your distributed labels. Anyone who's going to receive a sizable payment should go through a flow that is a little more involved than just does your face match your ID in this picture. And so we found this amazing company out of the UK called Arcarta, and they are the market leader in the fine art space. And the reason fine art was interesting is because it's highly regulated for anti-money laundering, and it requires a level of depth that is, just far beyond selfie liveness. It also is the kind of high-touch, white glove service industry where they have to deal a lot with, agents acting on behalf of principals, right? You're probably not, if Jeff Bezos is at an auction, he's probably not the one waving the paddle in Sotheby's. He probably has someone there. How do you make sure that the person waving the paddle is authorized to work on behalf of Jeff? Music is no different. How do you know that this representative is authorized to set up collections on behalf of this artist that they say they represent? And so Arcarta has solved all of that in a really elegant way. And so we partner with them, and we're bringing that to the music industry to try to create this called a walled garden of living records where, if more of the industry signs up to use Arcarta, those records will travel from place to place to place. It'll be less friction on the registrant of the person going through the flow, but it'll be a much higher level of security for all of the participants using it. So those two pieces are sort of the huge proactive safety elements of the operating system. And the other piece that we created, we could talk more about this, I'll shut up in a sec, is our recommendation system. So the other side of trust is, do you trust the things that you're being told to listen to? And so we took our, the way that we've been looking at streaming through this very pessimistic lens, and we inverted it, and we said, well, knowing everything we know about what bad looks like, what does good look like? And we ended up building a recommendation system for a large streaming service. And that's a cool product for us because it's very modular and it's going to work great in music, but it's also going to go anywhere outside of music where you have first party customer data and you have content to recommend to them. So film and television is the obviously first adjacent market in streaming, but we're going to go all sorts of places with Rexus.
I think that's fascinating. Tell me about, if I'm a client of yours, and let's say I'm a rights holder, I have X amount of releases, and I'm one of your customers. What does that look like? Do I have a dashboard? Does it alert me to certain problems? How do I make it actionable in my business?
Yeah, I would say that every customer has a different dashboard type. So if you're a distributor, for example, we're going to show you, the first question is, do you white label or not? So if you're a white label distribution service, meaning that you have other distributors with their own name brands, but they're actually using your pipes, do you do that or you don't do it? If you do it, you also need to see not just who the artists are that's gaming the system. So if you're taking artists in, are they manipulating streams or are they not? But do you have distributors who have a sort of a white label version of your software doing the same thing? Because that's very common with these white label services. You'll see fraudsters set up fake distribution companies and white label under 5, 6, 7 distro deals, so that if any one shuts down, they still have 4 or 5 others to operate in. And so the dashboards you get will show you how much fraud you have across every single streaming service, which artists are the problem, which ones are more common problems over time. You'll be able to track which songs and tracks or albums or UPC specifically are problems. You'll be able to see which white label distros are problems for you. We give you the full view because our belief is that you're never going to spend the tens of millions of dollars to recreate this yourself. It's too cumbersome, expensive. Even just the compute power alone is difficult. So we would rather not black box it. We give you all of the flags. We say, here's exactly why it's fraud. Here are all the individual reasons we've proven it's fraud, and we show you all of that. So when you have a dashboard from us as a customer, as a distro, for example, you'll see all that. If you're the DSP side, you're going to see which distros are your biggest problems, which artists are your biggest problems. Which sub labels and individual tracks, and then also because you're the DSP, you'll see which users. So when we work with the DSPs, they can see how many users are bots. We identify them as a bot or an account takeover, meaning that somebody just logged in as you and played a song 10 times, but it wasn't actually you. So what percentage of your accounts are struggling with account takeovers? You don't want to delete those accounts. You just want to password reset them. So the way that when you asked about like what do they do with that information, they will then automate things based off those flags we create that say, okay, these ones need password resets. These ones we're going to shadow ban. Maybe we're not going to tell them that they're fraudulent because we don't want them to change their techniques now that we found them. We just aren't going to pay them. And all of that money will be repaid to a real artist. So we work with every one of these customers in sort of a white glove bespoke way to say, when this flag occurs, how do you guys intend to operationalize it? And then we build all of those custom mechanisms for them so that they can just turn around and activate and sort of automate parts of their business that need automating, or in some cases manually review things. You know, uh, a collection society, for example, you might know something that doesn't show up in the data. So in their dashboard, it actually looks like a triage center where we surface all of the cases that we think are fraudulent payouts. And before they make a payout, whether that's monthly or quarterly, they'll go through those and say, actually, I know Morgan, and Morgan's working on behalf of this person. And even though it's highly suspect, this one's actually not fraud. And so they will then manually review all of those biggest potential risk vectors and then eliminate those. So we then built an operational tool for their operating team to use on a day-to-day basis where they like live in our system, flag things. Our model learns, okay, that's not fraud. It's called reinforced learning. We learn from the outcomes and then the model updates so that we aren't making those same mistakes. So it gets smarter and smarter over time. And we're in a place now that we're highly sophisticated and really refined with those partners.
It sounds like you have some incredible data coming through. How do you process all of that data? Are you using, AI? Are you using things to sort of look for patterns, and not just the patterns that and you know a lot of them, but sort of learning new patterns to show that maybe somebody's not streaming it properly, that it looks like it's fraud?
Yeah. I mean, from a data ingestion standpoint, I think we're now north of 7 or 8 trillion streams analyzed and 80-ish trillion, maybe 70 or 80 trillion data points. So like the bucket is ever expanding, and hat tip to our friends at Google for continuing to make the cloud products they do. So everything sort of lives in these partitioned client specific environments within BigQuery. And then the team does their work on top of that. I think one of the interesting learnings for me as a fairly non-technical, although maybe I'm getting more technical every day, but as a fairly non-technical person, is I thought the data science was the sort of wizardry, and it is, don't get me wrong. But the data engineering, the actual process of finding a way to get what you need from the client into our environment, normalize it, unify it in some way that the data scientists can actually work on it. It's a much more complex and challenging part of the problem than even some of the data science is. And when you're dealing with data at this scale, like one funky query that accidentally checks an all-time plays table instead of the last week's play table can be a $10,000 mistake. So how you manage and the systems that you set up both to alert you to things that are wrong, but also to make sure everything is separate, secure, and private, like it's an incredible undertaking for the team. So that's sort of like that's sort of a tactical level, like that's part of what we're doing. The machine learning sort of AI side of it, yeah, we use everything from, I think the history of AI goes back to like the 1950s or something, like the papers on decision trees well before computers. Some of those same sorts of models, random forests and XGBoosts and things of that nature, like are still used. There's a lot of what I would call tried and true machine learning that works really well for finding patterns. And now there are all these new tools that are coming out, and we're testing all of them all the time, but you don't actually need to use the most expensive version of the latest LLM to go and find some of these things. It's a combination of knowledge, which our team has like an abundance of. They are some of the smartest folks I've ever worked with. And then access to the data. And if you have those two things, if you have subject matter knowledge and creativity and access to the right data sets, you'd be surprised what you can accomplish with it. And so we'll keep playing with, new techniques and new models. But like, I would prefer if we were able to use, the approaches that we have for the last little while and not get to a place where we're deploying, I don't know, Gemini in service of what we're doing. One, because it's expensive, and two, because I don't think it's necessary, and three, I think the proof is in the pudding, and like we've done a really good job up to this point using all of this sort of tried and true, ML.
So
I would add too that like when we use AI, we build our stuff's very customized for us. And Gemini will have never trained on this data. And like,
Yeah.
ChatGPT, OpenAI would have never trained, or Anthropic would have never trained on this data. So when you try to just use an open source standardized model that has not been refined to the level that, like, when we look, for example, one of the questions I'm sure always comes up is false positives. How do we make sure that we're not calling someone fraud that actually isn't fraud? When we started, we would manually check 40,000 cases one by one by one. That process took us months. And those human in the loop training models can't be replicated without doing that. So we have years of transaction history then further than any of these models can be deployed. So it's not as easy as just saying, oh, I have some industry knowledge and I have Gemini. You actually have to manually train the two so that you have no false positives. So that when we call something fraud, we are absolutely certain it is fraud. We don't have a false positive issue because we've rooted out things like super fans or like, how do you know, to Morgan's point, that this is actually a real moment? How do you recommend this as something that's real? Well, it's because underneath that viral moment is a bunch of users who we can validate as not as fraud. Like their usage behavior is all unique. They aren't listening to the same content or the same ways. They all have unique patterns of usage and locations and speed. Like they are not at all uniform, which implies a true viral moment that should be recommended for the people to listen to of something similar. So my point is that, the recommendation side kind of comes from not having any false positives because we're so certain on the other side of that token. But we've spent years literally just checking all these different vectors of attack to make sure this is in fact not like a false positive. And I think that makes the AI tools we have so much more sophisticated than just rolling a model out. And you could never just roll a standard model out to do these things because it will always be wrong. Like there's going to be a massive false positive issue for anyone that just tries to cookie cutter turn a model loose.
yeah, I love that you use the technology, but also just the human experience to identify this stuff. Who do you think gets hurt the most from stream manipulation or fraud? Leaving AI out, just for a moment, but just the garden variety of just people trying to game the system. Who do you see that, gets hurt by that?
It's hard to like, it's funny. It's hard to measure hurt because you could do it in an economic sense, and then that would instantly just ladder up to the biggest rights holders. But I think of hurt as like who's the most defenseless and how do you protect them? And in the case of streaming fraud, the most defenseless party is the individual artist who's just trying to do their thing, make their art, make a living, get to the next album, get that tour financed, and even if you're at the top of your game for the biggest artist, it doesn't matter. The individual artist is the furthest removed from any ability to actually do something about this. The other side of the coin is like individual artists, sure, they could go hire a bot farm or they could, but the overwhelming majority of artists are legitimate and well-intentioned and not doing anything wrong. And so if you're in that bucket, then you look at a problem like this and you hear the numbers we talked about and you go, what can I do? And the answer is like, practically nothing, which is super frustrating. So I think for us, the reason, like what motivates us to do what we do is knowing that like, yes, we work on behalf of some of the biggest entities in the music industry, and that's great. That's where there is sufficiently aggregated information, data, at a granular enough level or with enough scale that our models will work. And that's great. And we're happy that like we love our clients and they're the best. But we're doing it, and in their cases, they're also doing it to protect the folks who have no ability to aggregate a data set and give it to a company like Beatdapp to say, is there something wrong here? Can you help? And I think one of the more frustrating parts of the job is we do periodically get emails from individual artists who have a story to tell that is like gut wrenching, whether it's, my stuff was taken down and this wasn't my fault and it's true, or I paid somebody a whole bunch of money for marketing services thinking that they were legit and they weren't, and now I'm out the money and my stuff's been taken down. What can I do? Like, those stories suck. And so we try really hard, one, to get our findings right so that we never are the reason why somebody has one of those stories. Two, we try to answer them, empathetically and say, look, like, there's very little as an individual that you can do, but there are folks out there working on your behalf to try to make sure that you aren't, either being robbed unfairly or, punished incorrectly, which I think are the two biggest risks for individual artists.
And I'm building on that, Morgan. You brought that up. It was actually just made me think of, we do a lot of independent artists. When you ask like who comes up to us the most at conferences, a lot of people, as you said, know who we are, especially big vendors. Independent artists come up and they're like, "Hey, I've had one recently at Mondo came up to me and was like, I got 200,000 streams this week, but like I haven't done anything. I'm like really confused what's happening." And you look at it and you're like, the problem is, if you're a fraudster, you can't just direct streams to you trying to generate streams for yourself. You need to create a shield of others around you so it doesn't look as obvious. And the easiest way and the most defenseless parties to do that with are typically independent artists. So a lot of times what's happening is artists who are not part of the fraud scheme are swept into this giant sort of fraud machine and are identified as fraud, and then blunt instrument taken down potentially off platforms. And like in one case, Morgan and I think it was either 30 or 40,000 artists total, but there was only 3 that were actually perpetuating the fraud. The other 30,000 artists were not fraudulent. They looked like fraud, but they weren't the actual beneficiaries of the fraud. So when we do it, not only do we say, hey, these are fraudulent streams, but when we go back to the streaming service with the information, we don't just say, here's 30,000. We say, here's the 3 you need to penalize. And here's the 30,000 that you just need to remove the streams, but not penalize, because they were not involved. They just were sort of accidental collateral damage in this scheme. And I think it's very important that that determination is made, because otherwise you just kick off 30,000 artists who are all independent artists who are defenseless, as Morgan pointed out, and were used in a scheme without their knowledge and are now just having an even harder time trying to, make a living off of what they love and what they do and all the work they've put in.
Wow, that is fascinating. Are there any genres or markets that typically lean more into fraud, or is it just across the board?
I don't think there's like a genre. I mean, there are regions, there are like hotspots in the world sometimes. Not to pick on any specific countries, but I think one of the challenges even when you're trying to make like a sort of a blanket assessment of what are the worst regions in the world for streaming fraud, you can appear to be wherever you want, right? Like, it takes very little technical ability to have your streams, your accounts appear in, one market when you're in another. And so even trying to say like this country or that country is a problem, sort of, maybe, but also it may just be that for whatever reason that fraudster wanted to move a chart position in, Brazil, but they're actually based in the US, or they wanted the streams to originate from Switzerland because it has a higher per stream rate than Indonesia. And so it's hard to like sort of say, bad country or like bad genre. I think, the AI music that is some of the hardest to detect as AI, as the sort of like purely instrumental electronic dance music, that kind of stuff. I could see that being a genre that fraudsters test into, because it might be the one that foils some of the detection methods, at least for the next little bit here. But even with that, like as we talk to our data scientists about what we're doing to be able to detect, artificial EDM, which is a thorny technical problem, we've made some incredible strides over the last few months. So I think even things like that, it's probably not worth trying to pick a genre and say like we'll be able to hide ourselves most effectively here because this is where lots of fraud happens and or no fraud happens and no one's looking. It doesn't really work like that.
I'm smiling a bit because I feel like the thing no one realizes is these are sophisticated fraud. Like, they run like businesses. They have HR, they have receptionists, they might have 1,000 people that work there for the purpose of fraud. Like, they have office buildings. Like, this isn't like a kid in a basement especially in some of these locations, and they have sophisticated technical analysts on them. They could be coming out of Russia pretending to be in France for the higher per stream payouts, or Switzerland. Like, to Morgan's point, this isn't generally a kid in a basement. Like, these are sophisticated fraudsters showing up for work every day, just like you and I show up for a job.
I imagine it's challenging. You just mentioned EDM music. So much of it is electronically created, or they use technology for that. I would imagine there's some challenges with that, but also with AI generated music or partially created AI music. We keep reading these stories about, songs that are, maybe the horn section or the string section is done with AI, or maybe they took an AI frame and built from it. I imagine what you're doing is going to get more complicated and challenging. If you can just look at the crystal ball for the next few years, what do you think your challenges are going to be as far as fraud detection in the next few years?
I mean, on the AI question, which I think is probably a big part of it, because that will be one of the most important tools for bad actors. I also think it'll be a really important tool for good. There's some incredible examples already of, Randy Travis is just one that comes to mind of, like incredible uses of this technology for the betterment of, humans and artistry, which is awesome. But I think the challenge will be exactly as you described, right? Detecting that which is fully synthetic versus that which is partly synthetic and partly human, versus what's entirely human created, but created using digital tools. And I've got a lot of confidence, just even on sort of early results from our side, that like we will be able to do full detection, partial detection, and entirely benign determinations across all genres and across sort of all vintages of music. So whether those are it's like big band spoofs, like we'll still be able to tell that those horns aren't real. So I think that's probably where we'll spend a fair amount of time on the AI music detection side. And then I think there's a much larger sort of business model question that's well above Andrew and I's pay grade, which is like, what's the industry as a whole doing with this new, genre, if we're going to call it that, of music or type of music. And then from that, I think detection will be one of the important sort of tactical obligations of certain parties in the value chain who are ingesting or distributing music, whether it's human or AI. And so if you're going to be in the business of serving music as a DSP, or you're going to be in the business of distributing content as a music distributor, I think you will have to know what is the source of, the AI music, to the extent that there are participants in the market like the Sunos and the Udios who are now going down the licensed path, and others. Did this work come from them, and how are we supposed to treat that economically and from a sort of copyright and commercial standpoint? The other side of the coin, and I think this is where the thing that we're working on will have a sort of enduring value, is despite there being big licensed, in high integrity AI LLM companies or LLM companies that are making music, there will also be a bunch of other folks who just use LLMs off the shelf, open source models, take training material from wherever they want to scrape it from, and then create their own music that way. And they won't be participants in the music economy in any way. And we'll need to see that too, right? We'll need to know how are we going to treat those tracks when they come up, through a distributor or on a DSP. And so I think that's where the detection tech is going to be really important. Like, it's not about actually doing the attribution and all of the licensing stuff that's going to be on the major rights holders and the independent rights holders through Merlin. We're really focused on the detection side of it. And then we'll let the business rules play out as a result once you know what you're looking at.
What you guys have built is so impressive. Where can people learn more about what you're doing, and all the progress you're making, and where can they learn more?
Beatdapp.
It's our website. Yeah. Beatdapp.com. Like, we have a brand new website that'll go through, everything that you need. So if you're a DSP, a collection society, content platform, like, we kind of have all the different pieces laid out there. So, yeah. And your podcast.
Well, anytime, you guys. Keep up the great work. It's always great talking with you guys. I find this stuff so fascinating, and it feels like it changes and evolves pretty regularly, and it's probably changed since we've been having this conversation. But I can't wait for our next conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate you having us on.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.